Ladies and gentlemen, please let me introduce our next speaker, Filip Outrata from the Department of Theology of Christian Traditions at the Protestant Faculty of the Charles University in Prague. Filip Outrata studied history, bohemistic, and ecumenical theology. He is also editor in the published house Vyšehrad and active in ecumenical dialogue and all kind of projects of coexistence. Thank you very much. The title of his contribution will be The Dark Side of Order. It sounds very dark. Churches and right-wing dictatorships in 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Well, certainly the title of this contribution promises much more than it can actually deliver, because the story of coexistence, cooperation, collaboration, maybe alliances between churches and various right-wing dictatorship would be very, very long, and it would take much more time, maybe for some specific other colloquium. But but the advantage is that, as I understand it, the aim of this meeting is not historical, so it's not about telling all the histories, but on concentrating on actual situations. So I try to elaborate on one point. What makes this kind of this form of authoritarian right-wing regimes attractive? What's the source of its appeal, or their appeal, to especially to some churches and some parts of churches, because of course we cannot speak about as a monolith, as a unified entity. So I will try to look at it, and it's also, of course, a little bit revealed in the title of this contribution. So the notion of order would be the central point of my contribution. But I would start not in the historical situation that I will focus on, but at the present time. As you all know, we had presidential elections 1 month ago, and one of the candidates, retired General Petr Pavel, used a slogan during his campaign: "Vraťme Česku řád a klid." Let us restore the order and quiet in Czechia. Let us return the order and quiet to Czechia. And I could see that quite a lot of my friends, of people leaning to the, let's say, left liberal environment, were quite appalled by this, and they were disquieted by this, and disliked this slogan, simply because it really resembles the slogans that used both the Nazis and the communists, and even the late real socialist regime in the 1970s and 1980s used this similar rhetoric. So, obviously it doesn't mean that Petr Pavel is a would-be right-wing authoritarian. And even in these elections, I would say the majority of these liberals voted for him in the second round, at least, against the man with the jezulátko in his pocket that we've seen in the first presentation of Petr, Andrej Babiš, a populist and media tycoon and billionaire. So, but at least I think this illustrates certain vulnerability, certain weaknesses of the liberal democratic regime, at least here in Czechia, in Czech Republic, in 34 years after the Velvet Revolution, because there is a need to stress the absence of order, the absence of quiet, and the necessity to bring it back. So, of course, when it's combined with the men in uniform, it is another dimension of this. But now let us come back to let us make the first historical leap in time. Let us return to 100 years ago, to the 1920s, to the situation after the Great War, when Europe was full of violence, the liberal democratic regimes were mostly weak. There were great fears of revolution, social problems were sharp, and later would be even more worsened by the Great Economic Depression. Nationalism is, of course, strong everywhere. Anti-Semitism, even among some intellectuals, including some prominent Czech Catholic authors. And the church, and now I will reveal that I will speak now specifically about the case study of the fascist Italy and the Roman Catholic Church. So, and the churches were haunted by, of course, mostly by secularism, atheism, socialism, as they were in the previous decades. And now it must be, of course, said that the churches, and now I'm turning more and more specifically to the Roman Catholic Church, the churches are in some way naturally conservative institutions. They are the guardians of order, the ones who preserve order, preserve itself. Of course, Christianity, and not Roman Catholic Christianity as well, is not only conservative, it's not always conservative. In some points, in some situations, it may, and it is, liberating force, even from some point of view, a revolutionary one. But at this precise historical junction, historical moment, it certainly, the element of order prevailed. Of course, now when we turn to the Italian fascist regime or dictatorship as the case study, it was certainly one of the first regimes of this kind, chronologically. It was specific in certain aspects, I think, but as was stated by Benito Mussolini and Giovanni Gentile in the Doctrine of Fascism, fascism is an organized, centralized, and authoritarian, maybe democracy or maybe regime, political system. And all these, I think all these traits, like the organized political system, centralized and authoritarian, have certain similarity, a certain appeal for the institution of the Roman Catholic Church. Of course, fascism understood itself as a religious force, not just a simple nationalist movement, but the fascist nationalism is in some way, it has some religious spiritual traits. They talked about nation advancing as one conscience and one will, a multitude unified by an idea and imbued with the will to live, and etc. So, of course, certainly it's a strong nationalism, but it has deep historical roots. Of course, in the case of Italy, it goes back to the ancient Roman times. That's much more favorable situation that many other nations can have. So that's one point. Of course, maybe the central idea would be the fascist corporatism or corporative system, in which divergent interests are coordinated and harmonized in the unity of the state. So it's a certain concept of a harmony of the whole, where all parts are playing together, not against each other, but together. And that is obviously, of course, contrary to the concept of the class struggle as a core idea of the socialist movement that was the greatest enemy, or the greatest adversary of the church. And of course, such a concept of order as a harmony seems to be quite close, maybe, to the idea, to the Christian idea of ordo, of a certain harmonious whole, where all its parts are not in internal strife, eternal fight, but they are working together, they are building together. So this also, of course, this is probably more a theory than a practical praxis, because as we all know, in Italy there were permanent strifes, and but this was an idea that was formulated and that certainly had to have some appeal. Of course, there is this fascinating thing of the personal development of the fascist, of Benito Mussolini and of the fascist movement, because as we know, he started as a quite radical left wing, even socialist, atheist, As a young age, he signed his articles as a vero heretico, like a real heretic. And he also had some story with Jan Hus. He was inspired by Jan Hus. Well, but and later he completely changed his position to the right-wing authoritarianism, including embracing of the Church, of the Roman Catholic Church, that was too much disliked of some of his fascist colleagues and comrades from the movement, from the beginnings of the fascist movement. So, and now if we look at because we could go to detail and talk about the history of the development between the Roman Catholic Church and the Italian state, but maybe we could have some broader view and recognize or see two kinds of motivations for the church representatives. One we would call opportunistic. Of course, to come close to the fascist regime was an opportunity, especially in Italy, to regain the former position, to regain the influence in the state that was for the most part lost after, as we know, after the dissolution of the Papal State in 1870 and the birth of independent Italy, modern Italy. So there was this conflicting situation, and this was an opportunity to end it, to come to this sort of harmony that we just talked about, and to become a part of this corporative system, to regain the former power, so to say, over the state. Of course, the power not in the military sense and political sense, but in the ideological sense. And that's what really happened. So in this aspect, it was successful. So the Italian church took over the religious institutions or in the schools, religion in the schools, and has had her former influence for the most part, not totally. Of course, there were the alliance or the between the church and fascist state was not smooth. There were crises, and and of course in 1930s it became more and more problematic. But we may probably talk about this opportunistic aspect. And of course, this is not the whole story. We can also see a sort of idealistic motivation, and that is really coming out of some sort of conservative and traditionalist Christian milieu, and this whole concept of order, of traditional order, was sympathetic to some people. And of course, one of them probably would be the Pope Pius XI, who personally was not not a big friend of democracy. He saw this as a problematic, and we can talk about sort of Catholic totalitarianism. So, this was the situation, and I think we could. There is no time for it, and I will not do it now. But I think we could find similar motivations and similar twofold motivation, like opportunistic and idealistic, in other cases, like of course, in the so-called social Catholic states, Catholic authoritarian states like Portugal, Spain, in many more interwar states like Croatia, Austria, Slovakia, and later in Latin American states or dictatorships like the Chile under Augusto Pinochet, and there would be many more examples. So this was so let's now make the second leap in time back to the present day. We may ask if the situation now in Europe is, in what way it is similar to that 100 years ago. The crisis of democracy or liberal democracy is discussed. There are very many, and it's on both sides of the Atlantic, not only in Europe. There are threats such as the threat of populism, and of course, we also see the surge of religious and political extremism and nationalism. And there are such subtitles or discussions about the dissatisfied parts of the society. I've just seen one of them in the Czech media. Can they overthrow the liberal democracy? It's in some part of the media, in some part of the liberal democratic establishment. This is seen as a real threat. So the democracy is seen as something that's vulnerable, that has serious threats to it. Obviously now it's all let's say has changed with the escalation, with the Putin's war in Ukraine, and so we can turn very briefly, because I think this will be much more in the. Yes, I'm coming to the end. It will be set probably in the next contribution. But I would say that we can, from one perspective, we can see Vladimir Putin as the man who restored order in Russia. I'm talking sort of inter-Russian perspective. After the devastating 1990s that brought impoverishment to very large parts of Russian society, economical breakdown, criminality, astronomical criminality, and also some sort of ideological vacuum after the fall of Soviet Empire with its even problematic, but still some complex ideas. And this vacuum was finally filled with nationalism plus conservative Christianity, Orthodox, of course, Christianity. Of course, here in this case of today's Russia, we can also see these two elements, like the opportunistic one. It was for the Russian Orthodox Church, it was opportunity to regain its privileged position in the state. It was, of course, lost during the Soviet historical experiment, but now it's back. But still, it has some idealistic element to it. These anti-Western, anti-liberal sentiments are strong in some parts of the Russian Orthodox Church and even beyond the borders of Russia. So now I have some 1-2 minutes to conclusion, I hope. So, well, the order as a certain idea or of the central point of this contribution is ambiguous. It has two sides. It's necessary because it enables life, creates safe environment, a situation where one can grow, where the society can prosper, of course. But on the other hand, and this is the dark side of order, it can stifle progress. In certain situations, it petrifies unjust, unfair conditions, even violent conditions. And this is precisely what happens in the right wing. I think it happens in the right-wing dictatorships. And we can ask, that would be the last question of this paper, how can organizations that in its inner structure is not democratic, not liberal, full-heartedly support liberal democracy? Of course, I am talking about the Roman Catholic Church, or maybe it would be better to put it more positively. How can it use this different pattern of organization and tradition to become a critical voice, but without being seduced by the authoritarian regime, authoritarian approaches? And the very last thought of this presentation, the central point, or the name of the whole colloquium is misuse of religion. Well, of course, what comes to our mind as first is the misuse as the wrong use, sort of a twisted use of religious ideas, religious ideologies, religious influence. But, of course, that's the central point. But there could be a second side of it. Maybe no use or passivity is also one form of misuse. So And I think that in the, as now I'll be speaking from my central focal point, that is the ecumenical theology. I think in the traditions, in theological, spiritual, historical, communal traditions of churches and Christian communities, there are lots of valuable potentials to convert, to work on, to work with, but it can only happen if there will be not this form of misuse, and I mean this lazy use or not using the traditions that we have, and that would be all. Thank you.